Part 1, Chapter 9 of En route by Joris-Karl Huysmans, translated by Charles Kegan Paul. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. He experienced that painful awakening of a sick man whom a doctor deceives for months, who learns some fine morning that he is to be taken at once to an hospital to undergo an urgent surgical operation. "But that is not the way things should be done," cried Durtal. "People should be prepared, little by little, accustomed by words of warning to the idea that they are to be cut up on a table. They are not struck down thus unexpectedly." Yes, but what does that matter, since I know very well in the depths of my soul that this priest is right? I must leave Paris if I wish to amend. But all the same, the treatment he inflicts is hard indeed to follow. I know not what to do. And from this moment his days were haunted by Trappists. He turned over the thought of his departure and examined it on all sides, chewed the cud of for and against, and ended by saying to himself that he would take stock of his reflections and open an account, and this with a debit and credit side, that he might know himself the better. The debit is terrible, to gather up his life and cast it into the stove of a cloister, and again he ought to know if his body were in a state to bear such a remedy. Mine is frail and soft, accustomed to rise late. It becomes weak if not nourished by flesh meat, and is subject to neuralgia at any change of the hour of meals. I should never be able to hold out down there with vegetables cooked in warm oil or in milk. First, I detest oily cookery, and I hate milk still more, which I cannot digest. Then I think I see myself on my knees, on the floor for hours. I who suffered so much at La Glacière in remaining in that posture on a step for scarce a quarter of an hour. Again, I am so accustomed to cigarettes that it is absolutely impossible to give them up, but it is pretty certain they will not let me smoke in a monastery. No, indeed, from the bodily point of view, this plan is madness. In my state of health, there is no doctor who would not dissuade me from undertaking such a risk. If I place myself in a spiritual point of view, I must then again recognize that it is terrible to enter La Trappe. I am afraid indeed that my dryness of soul, my want of love will remain, and then what would become of me in such surroundings? Then it is equally probable that in that solitude and absolute silence I should be wearied to death, and if it be so, what a miserable existence is it to stalk about a cell and count the hours. No, for that one needs to be firmly fixed on God, to be dwelt in wholly by Him. Moreover, there are two formidable questions which I have never properly weighed, because it has been painful to think of them. But now that they come before me and stop the road, I must face them, the questions of confession and Holy Communion. Confession? Yes, I will consent to it. I am so tired of myself, so disgusted with my wretched existence, that this expiation appears to me as deserved, even necessary. I desire to humble myself. I would ask pardon with all my heart. But again, this penance must be assigned me under possible conditions. At La Trappe, if I believe the abbé, no one will trouble himself about me. In other words, no one will encourage me and aid me to submit to this sorrowful extraction of my shames. I shall be somewhat like a sick man operated on in hospital, far from his friends and relatives. Confession, he went on, is an admirable discovery, for it is the most sensitive touchstone of souls, the most intolerable act which the Church has ever imposed on the vanity of men. Is this strange? We speak easily of our lapses, of our grosser actions, even indeed to a priest in conversation. That does not seem to lead to any consequences, and perhaps a little bragging enters into our admission of easy sins. But to tell the same thing on one's knees, accusing oneself after prayer, is different. That which was only rather amusing becomes a very painful humiliation, for the soul is not the dupe of this false seeming. It knows so well in its inner tribunal that all is changed. It feels so well the terrible power of the sacrament that he who but now smiled now trembles at the very thought. Now, were I to find myself face to face with an old monk who emerges from an eternity of silence to listen to me, a monk who will not aid me, perhaps cannot even understand me, this will be terrible. I shall never get to the end of my troubles if he does not hold out a staff to me, if he lets me stifle and gives no air to my soul, nor brings me help. The Eucharist also seems terrible. To dare to come forward, to offer him as a tabernacle the sewer of self scarce purified by repentance, a sewer drained by absolution, but still hardly dry, is monstrous. I am quite without such courage as to offer Christ this last insult, and so there is no good in fleeing to a monastery. No, the more I think of it, the more I am obliged to conclude that I should be mad if I ventured into a Trappist house. Now for the credit side. The only proper work of my life would be to make a parcel of my life, and take it to a cloister to disinfect it, and if that cost me nothing, where is the merit? Nothing shows me, on the other hand, that my body, however weakened, cannot support the regimen of La Trappe. Without believing or pretending to believe with the Abbé Gévresin that that kind of food will be even helpful to me, I ought to count on divine consolations, to admit the principle that, if I am sent there, it is not that I may take at once to my bed, or be obliged to leave again as soon as I arrive. At least, unless that is the chastisement prepared me, the expiation demanded. And again no, for that would be to ascribe to God pitiless tricks, and would be absurd. As to the cookery, it matters little that it is uncivilized, if my stomach can digest it. To have bad food and get up in the middle of the night is nothing, provided the body can stand it, and no doubt I shall find some means of smoking cigarettes by stealth in the woods. After all, a week is soon over, and I am not even obliged, if I feel poorly, to remain a week. From the spiritual point of view, I must again count on the mercy of God, believe that it will not abandon me, will dress my wounds and change the very foundation of my soul. I know well that these arguments do not rest on any earthly certainty, but yet if I have proofs that Providence has already taken part in my affairs, I have no reason to suppose that these arguments are weaker than the purely physical motives which served to support my other thesis. Now I must recall that conversion, so outside my will. I must take account of a fact which should encourage me, the weakness of the temptations which I now experience. It is difficult to have been more rapidly and more completely heard. Whether I owe this grace to my own prayers, or to those of the convents which have shielded me without knowing me, it is the case that for some time past my brain has been silent and my flesh calm. That monster Florence appears to me still at certain times, but she does not approach me, she remains in the shade, and at the end of the Lord's Prayer, the Ne nos inducas in tentationem puts her to flight. That is an unaccustomed fact, and yet a precise one. Why should I doubt, then, that I shall be better upheld at La Trappe than I am in Paris itself? There remain confession and communion. Confession. It will be what the Lord chooses it should be. He will choose the monk for me. I shall only be able to make use of him, and then the more disagreeable it is, the better worth it will be. And if I suffer much, I shall think myself less unworthy to communicate. That is, he went on, the most painful point. Communicate. But let us consider, it is certain that I shall be base in proposing to Christ that he should descend like a scavenger into my ditch. But if I wait till it is empty, I shall never be in a state to receive him, for my bulkheads are not closed, and sins would filter through the fissures. All this well considered, the Abbé spoke truth when he answered me one day, "But I too am not worthy to approach him. Thank God I have not those sewers of which you speak, but in the morning, when I go to say my Mass, and think of all the dust of the evening, do you not think that I am ashamed? It is always necessary, you see, to go back to the Gospels and say to yourself that he came for the weak and the sick, the publicans and lepers. And in fact, you must convince yourself that the Eucharist is a lookout post, a help, that it is given, as it is written in the ordinary of the Mass, ad tutamentum mentis et corporis, et ad medelam percipiendam. It is, if I may say so, a spiritual medicine. You go to the Saviour just as you go to a doctor. You take your soul to him to care for it, and he does so. I stand before the unknown, pursued Durtal. I complain that I am arid, and have wandered from the right way, but who will declare to me that, if I determine to communicate, I shall remain in the same mind? For indeed, if I have faith, I ought to believe in the occult work of Christ in the sacrament. Lastly, I am afraid of being wearied by solitude. I am not much amused here as it is, but at La Trappe I shall no longer have those vacillations at every minute, those constant fears. I shall at least have the advantage of having my time to myself. And then, how well I know solitude. Have I not lived apart since the deaths of des Hermies and Carré? Indeed, whom do I see? A few publishers, a few literary men, that my relations with these people are not interesting. As to silence, it is a blessing. I shall not hear any foolish sayings at La Trappe. I shall not listen to pitiable homilies and poor sermons. But I ought to rejoice on being at last isolated, far from Paris, far from men." He was silent, and made, as it were, a return in upon himself, and said to himself in a melancholy manner, "These strifes are useless, these reflections vain. I need not try to take account of my soul, to make out the debit and credit. I know, without knowing how, that I must go. I am thrust out of myself by an impulse which rises from the very depths of my being, to which I am quite certain I have to yield." At that moment Durtal had decided, but 10 minutes afterwards the attempt at resolution vanished. He felt his cowardice gain on him once more, he chewed once more the cud of arguments against his moving, came to the conclusion that his reasons for remaining in Paris were palpable, human, certain, while the others were intangible, extranatural, and consequently subject to illusions, perhaps false. And he invented for himself the fear of not obtaining the thing he feared, said to himself that La Trappe would not receive him, or certainly that it would refuse him communion, and then he suggested to himself a middle term, to confess at Paris and communicate at La Trappe. But then there passed in him an incomprehensible fact. His whole soul revolted at this idea, and the formal order not to deceive himself was truly breathed into him, and he said to himself, "No, the bitter draught must be drained to the last drop. It is all or nothing. If I confess to the abbé, it will be in disobedience to absolute and secret directions. I should be capable of not going afterwards to Notre-Dame-de-Lâtre. What shall I do?" And he accused himself of distrust, called to his aid once more the memory of benefits received, how scales had fallen from his eyes, his insensible progress towards faith, his encounter with that singular priest, perhaps the only one who could understand him, and treat him in a way so benign and so elastic. But he tried in vain to reassure himself. Then he called up the dream of the monastic life, the sovereign beauty of the cloister. He imagined the joy of renunciation, the peace of exalted prayers, the interior intoxication of the spirit, the delight of not being at home any longer in his own body. Some words of the abbé about La Trappe served as a springboard for his dreams, and he perceived an old abbey, grey and warm, immense avenues of trees, clouds flying confusedly amid the song of waters, silent strolls in the woods at nightfall. He called up the solemn liturgies of St. Benedict's time. He saw the white pith of monastic chants rise under the scarcely pruned bark of sound. He succeeded in his decision and cried, "You have dreamed for years of the cloisters, now rejoice that you will know them at last." And he wished to go at once and live there. Then suddenly he fell down into reality and said to himself, "It is easy to wish to live in a monastery, to tell God that you would desire to take shelter therein, when life in Paris weighs you down. But when it comes to the real point of emigration, it is quite another matter." He turned over these thoughts everywhere, in the street, at home, in the chapels. He hurried like a shuttle from one church to another, hoping to solace his fears by changing his place, but they persisted and rendered every place intolerable. Then in the sacred places came always that dryness of soul, the broken spring of impulse, a sudden silence within, when he desired consolation in speaking to him. His best moments, his pauses in the hurly-burly, were a few minutes of absolute torpor, which rested like snow on the soul, and he heard nothing. But this drowsiness of thought lasted but a while. The whirlwind blew once more, and the prayers which were wont to appease it refused to leave his lips. He tried religious music, the despairing sequences of the Psalms, pictures of the crucifixion by the early masters, to excite him, but his prayers ran on and became confused on his lips, were divested of all sense, mere words, empty shells. At Notre-Dame-des-Victoires, where he dragged himself that he might thaw a little under the warmth of his neighbours' prayers, he did in fact feel less chilly, and seemed to break up a little, fell drop by drop into sorrows which he could not formulate, and were all summed up in the cry of a sick child, in which he said to Our Lady in low tones, "My soul is sorrowful." Thence he returned to Saint-Séverin, sat down under those arches browned by the rust of prayers, and, haunted by his fixed idea, he pleaded for himself extenuating circumstances, exaggerated the austerities of La Trappe, tried almost to exasperate his fear to excuse his weakness in a vague appeal to Our Lady. "But I must go and see the Abbé Gévresin, he murmured, but his courage still failed him to pronounce the yes which the priest would surely require from him. He ended by discovering a reason for his visit, without thinking himself obliged to promise just yet. After all, he thought, I have no precise information about this monastery. I do not even know whether it may not be necessary to take a long and expensive journey to get there. The Abbé indeed declares that it is not far from Paris, but it is impossible to decide on this simple declaration. It will be useful also to know the habits of these Cenobites before going to stay with them. The Abbé smiled when Durtal mentioned these objections. The journey is short, he said. You start from the Gare du Nord at 8 o'clock in the morning for Saint-Landry, where you arrive at 11:45. You lunch at an inn close to the station, and while you are drinking your coffee they get you a carriage, and after a drive of 4 hours you arrive at Notre-Dame-de-Lâtre for dinner. There is no difficulty there. Then the cost is moderate. As far as I remember, the railway fare is about 15 francs, add 2 or 3 francs for lunch, and 6 or 7 for the carriage. And as Durtal was silent, the Abbé went on. Well? Yes. If you knew. I am in a pitiable state. I will and will not. I know well that I ought to take refuge there, but in spite of myself, I wish to gain time and put off the hour of departure. And he continued, My soul is out of gear. When I would pray, my senses go all astray. I cannot recollect myself. And if I succeed in pulling myself together, 5 minutes do not pass, but I am all astray again. No, I have neither fervour nor true contrition. I do not love God enough, if it must be said. And indeed, during the last 2 days, a frightful certainty has grown up in me. I am sure that in spite of my good intentions, if I found myself in the presence of a certain person whose sight troubles me, I should send religion to the devil. I should return eagerly to my vomit. I only hold on because I am not tempted. I am no better than when I was sinning. You will admit that I am in a wretched state to enter a Trappist monastery. Your reasons are at least weak, answered the Abbé. You say first that your prayers are distracted, that you are unable to concentrate your attention, but in fact you are just like everybody else. Even Saint Teresa declares that often she was unable to recite the Credo without distraction. It is a weakness in which we must just take our portion humbly. Above all things, it is necessary not to lay too much stress on these evils, for the fear of seeing them return ensures their assiduity. You are distracted in prayer by the very fear of distraction and by regret for it. Go forth more boldly, look at things more widely, pray as best you can, and do not trouble yourself. Again, you declare that if you meet a certain person whose attraction is a trouble to you, you will succumb. How do you know that? Why should you take care about seductions which God does not yet inflict upon you, and which he will perhaps spare you? Why doubt his mercy? Why not believe, on the contrary, that if he judged the temptation useful, he will aid you enough to prevent your sinking under it? In any case, you ought not, by anticipation, to fear disgust at your weakness. The Imitation declares, There is nothing more foolish and vain than to afflict ourselves about future things which may perhaps never happen. No, it is sufficient to occupy ourselves with the present, for sufficient for the day is the evil thereof. Sufficit diei malitia sua. Finally, you say you do not love God. Again I answer, what do you know about it? You have this love by the very token that you desire to have it, and that you regret you have it not. You love our Lord by the very fact that you desire to love him. That is special pleading, murmured Durtal. But indeed, he went on, suppose at La Trappe the monk revolted at the long outrage of my sins, refused me absolution, and forbade me to communicate. The Abbé burst out laughing. You are mad. What is your notion of Christ? Not of Christ, but of his intermediary, the human being who replaces him. You can only chance upon a man pointed out beforehand from above to judge you. Moreover, at Notre-Dame-de-Lâtre you have every chance of kneeling at the feet of a saint. Therefore God will inspire him, will be present. You have nothing to fear. As to the communion, the prospect of being rejected terrifies you, but is not that one proof the more that, contrary to your opinion, God does not leave you insensible? Yes, but the idea of communicating alarms me nonetheless. I say to you again, if Jesus were indifferent to you, it would be just the same to you to consume or not to consume the sacred species. "All that does not convince me," sighed Durtal. "I do not know where I am. I am afraid of a confessor, of others, of myself. It is foolish, but it is stronger than I. I cannot gain the upper hand." "You are afraid of the water. Imitate Gribouille. Throw yourself in boldly. Look, suppose I write to La Trappe this very day to say you are coming. When?" "Oh," cried Durtal, "wait a while." "To get an answer, we need 2 days each way. Will you go there 5 days hence?" And as Durtal was astounded and silent, "Is that settled?" Then, at that moment, Durtal had a strange experience, as often at Saint-Séverin, a sort of caressing touch and gentle push. He felt a will insinuate itself into his own, and he drew back, disquieted at seeing he had a double self, to find he was no longer alone in the depth of his being. Then he was inexplicably reassured and gave himself up, and as soon as he had said yes, he felt immediately relieved. Then, passing from one extreme to the other, he was troubled at the idea that his departure could not take place at once, and was sorry that he had still to pass 5 days in Paris. The abbé laughed. "But the Trappists must have notice. It is a simple formality. For with a word from me you will be received at once, but wait at least until I have sent this word. I will post it this evening, so have no anxiety and sleep in peace." Durtal in his turn laughed at his own impatience. "You must think me very ridiculous," he said. The priest shrugged his shoulders. "Come, you asked me about my little monastery. I must try to satisfy you. It is very small if compared with the Grande Trappe at Soligny, or the establishments at Sept-Fonds, Meilleret or Aiguebelle, for there are only about 10 choir fathers and about 30 lay brothers or convertis. There are also a certain number of peasants who work with them, and help them to till their land and make their chocolate." "They make chocolate?" "That surprises you. How do you think they live? I warn you, you are not going into a sumptuous monastery." "I like it so. But in regard to the stories of La Trappe, I suppose the monks do not greet each other with 'Brother, we must die,' and that they do not dig their graves every morning." "All that is false. They take no trouble about their graves, and they salute each other silently, since they are forbidden to speak." "Then what am I to do if I need anything?" "The abbot, the confessor, and the guest master have the right of conversing with the guests. You will have to do with them alone. The others will bow when you meet them, but if you speak to them, they will not answer." "It is well to know that. What is their dress?" "Before the foundation of Citeaux, the Benedictines wore, or so it is supposed, the black habit of Saint Benedict. The Benedictines properly so called wear it still, but at Citeaux the colour was changed, and the Trappists, who are a twig of this branch, have adopted the white robe of Saint Bernard." "Pray pardon all these questions, which must seem childish, but since I am about to visit these monks, I ought to be in some measure acquainted with the customs of their order." "I am wholly at your disposition," replied the abbé. Durtal asked him about the situation of the abbey itself, and he replied, "The present monastery dates from the 18th century, but you will see in the gardens the ruins of the old cloister, which was built in the time of Saint Bernard. In the Middle Ages there was a succession of blessed in this convent. It is a truly sanctified land, fit for meditation and regret. The abbey is situated at the bottom of a valley according to the orders of Saint Bernard. For you know that if Saint Benedict loved the hills, Saint Bernard sought the low and moist plains wherein to found his convents. An old Latin line has preserved the different tastes of these two saints. Bernardus Valles, Coles Benedictus amabat." Was it on account of his own personal liking, or for a pious end, that Saint Bernard built his hermitages in unwholesome and flat places? "In order that his monks, whose health was enfeebled by the fogs, might have constantly before their eyes the salutary image of death." "The deuce he did!" "I may add at once that the valley in which Notre-Dame-de-Lâtre rises is now drained, and the air is very pure. You will stroll by delightful ponds, and I may recommend you, on the borders of the enclosure, an avenue of secular chestnuts, where you may take some refreshing walks at daybreak." And after a silence the Abbé Gévresin continued, "Walk there a good deal. Traverse the woods in all directions. The forests will tell you more about your soul than books. Aliquid amplius invenies in Silvius quam in libris, wrote Saint Bernard. Pray and your days will seem short." Durtal went away from the priest's house comforted, almost joyful. He felt at least the solace of a fixed decision, a resolution taken at last. He said to himself that the only thing now to be done was to prepare himself as best he could for the retreat, and he prayed and went to bed for the first time for months with his mind at rest. But next day when he woke, his mood changed, all his preconceived ideas, all his fears returned. He asked himself if his conversion were ripe enough to allow him to cut it separate and carry it to La Trappe. The fear of a confessor, the dread of the unknown assailed him afresh. I was wrong to have answered so soon, and he asked himself, why did I say yes? The recollection of this word pronounced by his lips, conceived by a will which was still his own and yet other than his, came back to his mind. It is not the first time that such a thing happened to me, he thought. I have already experienced, when alone in the churches, unexpected counsels, silent orders, and it must be admitted that it is terrifying to feel this infusion into self of an invisible being, and to know that he can, if he choose, almost turn you out of the domain of your personality. But no, it is not that. There is no substitution of an exterior will to one's own, for one's free will is absolutely intact. Neither is it one of those irresistible impulses endured by certain sick persons, for nothing is more easy than to resist it. It is still less a suggestion, since in this case there are no magnetic passes, no somnambulism induced, no hypnotism, nor is it the irresistible entrance into oneself of a strange will, the sudden intrusion of a precise and discreet desire, the pressure on the soul at once firm and gentle. Again I am incorrect and play the fool, but nothing can describe that close pressure which vanishes at the least movement of impatience. It is felt but cannot be expressed. Its introduction is always attended by surprise, almost with anguish, since it does not make use of even an interior voice to make itself heard, and is formulated without the aid of words. All is blotted out, the breath which has thrilled you disappears. You would wish that this incitement should be confirmed, that the phenomenon should be repeated in order to be more closely observed, to try to analyze it and understand it, when lo, it is gone. You remain alone with yourself. Are free not to obey, your will is unfettered and you know it, but you know also that if you reject these invitations you take on yourself unspeakable risks for the future. In fact, pursued Durtal, it is an angelic influx, a divine touch, something analogous to the interior voice so well known by the mystics, but it is less complete, less precise, and yet it is quite as certain. He ended his dreams, concluding, I am consumed and collared by myself, before being able to answer this priest, whose arguments would scarce persuade me unless I had had this help, this unexpected succour. But then, since I am thus led by the hand, what have I to fear? He feared all the same, and could not be at peace with himself. Then, if he profited by the comfort of a decision, he was consumed for the moment by the expectation of his departure. He tried to kill time in reading, but he had to admit once more that he could not expect consolation from any book. None came even distantly into relation with his state of mind. High mysticism was so little human, soared at such heights far from our mire, that no sovereign aid could be expected from it. He ended by falling back on the imitation, in which mysticism, placed within the reach of the crowd, was like a trembling and plaintive friend who stanched your wounds within the cells of its chapters, prayed and wept with you, and in any case compassionated the desolate widowhood of souls. Unfortunately, Durtal had read so much and was so saturated with the Gospels that he had temporarily exhausted their sedative and soothing virtues. Tired of reading, he again began his courses in the churches. And suppose the Trappists will not have me, he thought. What will become of me? But I tell you that they will receive you, said the abbé whom he went to see. He was not easy till the day the priest handed him the answer from La Trappe. He read, We will receive with pleasure for a week in our guest house the retreatant whom you wish to commend to us, and I do not see at the moment any reason why the retreat should not begin next Tuesday. In the hope, Monsieur l'Abbé, that we shall also have the pleasure of seeing you again in our solitude, I beg to assure you that I am yours most respectfully, F.M. Etienne, guest master. He read and reread it, at once delighted and terrified. There is no further doubt. It is irrevocable, he said, and he went at once in haste to Saint-Séverin, having less need of prayer than of going near to Our Lady, of showing himself to her, paying her, as it were, a visit of thankfulness, and expressing his gratitude by his very presence. He was taken by the charms of that church, its silence, the shadow which fell on the apse from the height of its palm trees of stone, and he ended by caring for nothing and sinking on a chair, filled with one sole desire, not to enter again on the life of the streets, never to leave his refuge, never to move. The next day, which was a Sunday, he went to the Benedictine nuns to hear High Mass. A black monk celebrated. He recognized a Benedictine when the priest chanted Dominus vobiscum, for the Abbé Gévresin had told him that the Benedictines pronounced Latin like Italian. Though he was not inclined to like that pronunciation, which took away from Latin the sonorous tones of its words, and turned after a fashion the phrases of that tongue into a ring of bells with their clappers muffled, or their vases stuffed with tow, he let himself go, taken hold of by the unction, by the humble piety of the monk, who almost trembled with reverence and joy when he kissed the altar, and he had a deep voice, to which, behind the grating, answered the clear, high voices of the nuns. Durtal panted, listening to the fluid pictures of the early masters sketch and form and paint themselves on the air. He was affected to his very marrow, as he had formerly been during High Mass at Saint-Séverin. He had lost that emotion now in that church, where the flower of melody had faded for him since he knew the Benedictine plain song, and he now found it again, or rather he took it with him from Saint-Séverin to this chapel. And for the first time he had a wild desire, a desire so violent that it seemed to melt his heart. It was at the moment of the communion. The monk, elevating the host, uttered the Domine non sum dignus. Pale, with drawn features, sorrowful eyes, and serious mouth, he seemed to have escaped from a monastery of the Middle Ages, cut out of one of those Flemish pictures where the monks are standing in the background, while before them nuns are praying on their knees with joined hands, near the donors, to the child Jesus on whom the Virgin smiles, while lowering her long lashes under her arching brow. And while he descended the steps and communicated to two women, Durtal trembled, and his desires went forth towards the ciborium. It seemed to him that if he were nourished on that bread, there would be an end of all his dryness and all his fears. It would seem to him that the wall of his sins, higher and higher from year to year, and now barring his view, would roll away, and at last he would see. And he was in haste to set off for La Trappe, that he too might receive the sacred body from the hands of a monk. That Mass gave him new strength like a tonic. He came out of the chapel joyful and firmer, and when the impression grew somewhat feebler in the course of hours, he remained perhaps less affected, but still resolute, joking in the evening with a gentle melancholy about his condition. There are many people who go to Barège or Vichy to cure their bodies. Why should I not go and cure my soul in a Trappist monastery? End of Part 1, Chapter 9.